When my daughter Ninda was born, I wrapped her in a possum skin cloak. It's part of my culture. On the first skin, I burned what I knew about my grandfather, William Townsend Onus. But there are things about my grandfather that still remain a mystery. Bill, the successful entrepreneur, the theatre impresario, the entertainer, the fighter for his people's rights. But one photograph really made me curious. I'd been told by my father Lynn that Bill made movies, that he might be the first Aboriginal filmmaker. Did my grandfather make this film? And if he did make it, why did he make it?
In those days, you never had any assistance. There was nothing for blackfellas.
You're excluded from going into public places, and if you were able to go to the movies, you could only sit down in the front stalls.
Bill would go and talk anywhere to anyone to keep Koori culture alive. Don't just let it go off quietly into the past.
The story goes that most of his movies were burnt up in a caravan fire. But there are rumours that some of Bill's films are still out there.
Hey, Tiriki, oh, good to see you, big fella.
Terrific.
This footage is extremely rare. To see this today for the first time is fascinating for me.
It was just so good for us to see an Aboriginal man telling our stories.
William Onus really made an impact on my life.
We cannot help but wonder why has it taken the white Australians just on 200 years to recognise us as a race of people. I'm speaking for what I firmly believe. And each and everything I said, I do not apologise for.
Tiriki Onus, Alec Morgan, congratulations so much on ABLAZE. It's an extraordinarily powerful work, and here's hoping it gets the eyeballs that it deserves, because it's a wonderful documentary.
Thank you.
Tiriki, I first want to come to you. Describe as best you can that moment when you first saw the young Bill and watched the rediscovered film footage. What did this kind of acknowledgement of heritage immediately mean to you?
Look, it was an extraordinary moment, being presented with images, moving images, and what felt to me a very real, and what still feels to me a very real and palpable connection to Bill, my grandfather, and to so many of my family who were presented in this little 9.5 minute piece of silent footage that Alec had found in the archive. It was quite extraordinary, and I knew then and there that I wanted to do something more with it. I was just sitting in a little cafe on South Bank Boulevard with Alec when he came down from Sydney, all excited to show it to me, and instantly after I'd seen this film and Alex just quite gently asked, "Oh, do you think you might like to make a film out of this?" I didn't need any time to think. I knew that it was a yes. I've always felt incredibly close to Bill in my life, even though we've been separated by 12 years between when he passed and when I was born. But this was an opportunity for me to reconnect with my grandfather in a new and an exciting way. And having known Alec's work of the past, I immediately knew that this was an incredible opportunity that I wanted to be a part of more than anything. It was an extraordinary awakening, and still to this day, quite a gift that I consider myself incredibly fortunate to have received.
Alec, do you recall that South Bank meeting in a similar way? The thought of showing Tiriki this footage?
Absolutely, yeah. I think it was Simon Drake at the National Film and Sound Archive who brought my attention to it, because my background for a number of years has been archival footage and Australian history through archives. So Simon Drake in Sydney brought my attention to it, and having a look at it, I knew, I recognised Bill Onus and his brother and a few other people are in there. And thoughts went immediately to contact Tiriki, who I hadn't met before, but I knew of him and his work he was doing in Melbourne. So I'm in Sydney, so I took it down to Melbourne to show Tiriki. So that's how it started.
Alec, from a filmmaker's perspective, and as you say, as someone who's invested such a great deal of creative energy into melding film craft and indigenous themes and examining history, what about Bill most resonates with you? Who was the man that you saw in this footage? The creative man.
I think, like Tiriki, I'd known Bill Onus for a number of years because, I'd done a film about the stolen generations and spoken to many years ago with his relatives and contemporaries who were involved in the civil rights action at that time. And the thing I felt about Bill Onus was that he was left out of history because he was quite radical for his time. I mean, when you see Bill now, and I come from a theatre background too, and I was particularly interested. I knew Bill had put on theatre in Melbourne to support the civil rights campaign. So finding that piece of footage was like, we didn't know, but just seeing Bill in the film and the others, you kind of felt Bill was probably behind this film.
I agree. We praise and we sort of laud such film pioneers as Charles Chauvel and Kenji Hall when we're naming awards and opening buildings and that sort of stuff. Is it now a matter of urgency that real pioneers like Bill or women directors like Lottie Lyle get the same degree of public recognition? Would he want that? Do you want that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's why Tiriki and I came together, really, to tell Bill's story. But it was also the intrigue that both of us had the same questions of, what's the background of some of these scenes that we saw in this silent film, because there was no record. I mean, the reason why Simon Drake asked me about it, because there was no record. It was somehow dumped in the National Film and Sound Archive. And so it'd been there for a number of years, but he had brought it out and had, copied it, and so it was an intrigue for both of us. We're a bit like two detectives, which I love about, filmmaking, where there's a kind of question about what's going on, what are these people doing, how was it made, who made it. So it was a journey, a long period of research, because anything indigenous is very difficult to discover. There just isn't the documentation to it. Sure. But luckily, Bill was somebody who used the press very well. Mm-hmm. And so there was records of Bill actually having a 16mm camera and cameras, and, through all that research, the pieces started to come together, which we tried to put into a journey through the film of unfolding, like layers of the story of this 9-minute piece of film that was in the archive.
Tiriki, as the research was exposing and revealing all these incredible moments from your family's history, this must have been, and a lot of this is of course captured in the film, but it must have been an extraordinarily emotional journey for you as well.
It was. I mean, hugely so. And I think this opportunity to reconnect with Bill and with these stories, I mean, I'd always, as I said before, always felt very close to Bill, and he'd lived in those kind of family mythologies that we have for members of family who were sort of larger than life, who aren't around anymore. And throughout much of my life, I think I'd had to make estimations and suppositions about what Bill would have thought about X or Y. But in the making of this and going through the journey, which was at times trying and certainly confronting from both an emotional and an intellectual point of view, the thing that really happened was that so many of the beliefs that I'd held about Bill were reinforced and came back, and I now feel them to be even more true than what they seemed before. It was an amazing process, and particularly seeing the level of ownership that others had over Bill as well. That was what was beautiful. I don't think that Bill and this story particularly belong to me. I think I've got a responsibility to make sure it keeps getting told. But largely, Bill belongs to all of those people whom he touched. We were so fortunate that this happened now, and that we weren't waiting another generation for the film to be found, where we wouldn't necessarily have access to those elders and community members who had the memories of Bill, who had those personal recollections and connections. It was incredibly fortuitous that we were able to connect with so many people who were willing to give so generously, both of their time and their knowledge, and contribute their stories to the record and to history now that we're able to keep seeing back. So it has been incredibly emotional. Also emotional for me was the fact that I think of how long it took us to make this film, which was about 6.5 years or so, 7 years really, from that first meeting through to when we finally showed it. And to think that when I started this project, I didn't have any children, and now I have 3. I count the length of this film in kids, but the fact that they now have this legacy, they now have this point of access to their great-grandfather and to the generations from before is truly wonderful. I think that's very much part of Bill as well, thinking about how we give things on and hand things on to the future, not worrying perhaps so much about getting the credit, in inverted commas, for things, but being far more concerned that the thing, whatever it is, happens and what the knock-on effect of that is. Now we're in the fortunate position where Alec and I are able to advocate for history and for the names of Bill and his contemporaries to be known and to be celebrated. But at the end of the day, I think the message is still very much present, and it's in some ways encouraging and strengthening, but in other ways quite challenging to think that the things that Bill was advocating for and talking about 70 years ago quite often are still the conversations that we're having now.
Yeah, that's very true. Through this remarkable archival footage and the research that you've afforded Bill's life under white man rule, ABLAZE is as potent a film statement of the systemic racism in Australia as I've seen. Was that always your intention, or did it just emerge as part of Bill's story from that time?
I think it's just part of the reality. I don't think we could have done it any other way. I think
it's based on, a lot of research. So the factual side of it about racism in Australia is something that I've been investigating for many years. I did the first film on the stolen generations when no one knew anything about it. The word didn't exist. So there is a kind of enormous silence within Australia about talking openly about the past, about racism. Even now, there's always attempts to kind of deny it, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, and not taking much action socially in Australia that could actually rectify it in a meaningful way. So the reason for making a film like this is that it is a conversation that is very important about the past. We need to look at the past and deal with the past, but we also need to have knowledge of the past.
Yeah.
This film, just for example, Simon, was incredibly difficult to fund. Now, it seems strange, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But it's almost like sometimes you wonder if I mention the word, segregation, if you mention the words, something else, you won't get your funding. And it was incredibly difficult. So it shows that the underlying current of trying to maintain a silence about Australia's past is still ongoing. And so the making of the film for both Tiriki and I was to bring knowledge of that past.
Yeah.
And it took a lot of research. I mean, our research is very solid. I was lucky I got a research fellowship at Macquarie University in Sydney, and that was full-time. So I could research full-time over a 3-year period. So, you know, it's pretty much based on what we could find of the past, you know, plus the amount of time we had to spend to try and find the material about backing what you see on the screen.
One thing that I'm particularly struck with the film, and I'm going off script here a bit, so forgive me if I stumble a bit, but
no,
even in addressing the sins of the past and the horrible ways in which our Indigenous people have been treated in the past, it's still very much told, the narrative is still very much driven from a white man's perspective. It's we get to hear what we want to hear and what they want to tell us, what the people in power, which has always been white society, wants to tell us. What I find with this film is that it gives such a strong voice to all these, to all the moments and to all the injustices that the Indigenous people have suffered in their voice, from their perspective. And I think that comes through in Bill's struggles and activism and in what you guys do with this film.
Well, that's true. I mean, you know, it takes a long time, and we luckily, you know, we got knocked out of every funding body. And of course, you know the reality in Australia today. We have a ABC, our national broadcast, is not even putting on a debate about the, you know, elections, and it's been crippled. It's a major area. We might be able, you know, get something seen of this, you know, kind of serious look at the past. And universities have been crippled in many ways too. So there's been a lot of interference about telling the past. I mean, humanities in particular, and I mean history, has been, again, attacked in a different way than it was a number of years ago. But it seems to be a threat to people to reveal the past as it was. That's why our research is so solid. That's why the film is so solid. And backing it up, again, with a film like Lousy Little Sixpence, nearly 40 years ago, was to back up what we say with archival evidence. So Tiriki and I, you know, are kind of like lawyers, if you like. We know that everybody will try and, you know, not take it seriously or deny it. And that's been inbred, you know. I mean, that's been part of the systemic way of avoiding issues of the past. So there's a lot that hasn't been told about Australia. And I think, you know, this film, we hope, will rectify one element of the past through Bill's story, and also giving honour to Bill that this man gave his life to fighting for what was equality and civil rights in Australia. And he had to spend his life doing that, as did other fighters and other individuals who gave their lives towards, you know, speaking and giving voice to those people who didn't have voice. So it's something that needs to be taken in Australia of value rather than denying what's going on. So that is, you know, part of, you know, how I think Australia suffers from something that I call willful amnesia.
Yes.
And I think another big part of this process that, I mean, I suppose we talked about it, Alec, but it was always a given in many ways to think of the question you raised there as well, Simon, and that we knew that we had to support the claims and the conversation we were making through our research, and that it was of paramount importance that we have a First Nations voice and an Indigenous authority throughout the film, that everything came through that lens. And that authority didn't necessarily come from me, that came from the elder statespeople and those who were giving the film their blessing, who were contributing their stories to it, that their oral histories and their memories would be backed up by that significant research. And also that we wanted to take a very strength-based approach to this conversation, that we would talk about the trials and tribulations, certainly. However, at the same time, we were also able to focus predominantly on the tremendous strength. The fact that people were not victims and were not cowed by this, but were instead building and being incredibly powerful in that space. And that strength-based discourse, as opposed to one that came from a place of deficit, I hope, follows through the entire film, and the sense of allyship between both Indigenous and non-Indigenous activists of the day as well. You see in the recordings of the performances with the new theatre and places like that, this wasn't happening in a vacuum. And these are elements of history that go unseen. Even when we're told histories of Aboriginal Australia, quite often they come through the lens of the deficit. And generally, it's not the thing that we, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, want to talk about. We talk about the great strengths. You see that in films like Lousy Little Sixpence, that Indigenous authority which dictates where the film goes. And that was certainly, I think, right at the very forefront of our minds throughout everything as we went through the making of ABLAZE. We wanted to tell these stories, we wanted to be strong and acknowledge that unseen history. I mean, they say that those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it, and that's certainly true. But at the same time, I'd also say that those who don't see history and who are not able to celebrate history also run the risk of never seeing some of those great strengths happen again as well. Yeah, and sometimes we think about what we do now is terribly new and exciting. It's exciting, but we follow in the footsteps of extraordinary people who have been there before us as well.
As pioneers, whether in the arts or social activism or political change, Bill and Reg Saunders and Doug Nichols and your Uncle Eric, they truly forged an untrodden path. Would Bill and his contemporaries feel their struggles are being honoured in 2022? How would they look at the path of the election campaigning, as you mentioned, Alec, or the role that Indigenous issues take in our current climate? How would they take it?
I don't know. I wonder and I worry at times. Quite often we are asked to compromise an awful lot in these conversations. And one of the things that comes back for me, with whether it be Bill or Uncle Doug or Uncle Eric and others, and certainly looking at the film from 1946, you see just how self-assured and uncompromising our activists were in that space, and that we can always strive for and hope and expect better and expect more. And I certainly hope that carries through, and that we're able to see that authority in the space and feel that we have got the freedom to expect more and expect better, and perhaps not feel that we have to compromise in these spaces, but that we can really dream about what a real and empowered future looks like.
I'm just so happy and so proud that we did get the film finished.
Yeah.
And again, I stress it's not easy, and it hasn't been easy. Making serious works of the past has always been kind of under attack. I mean, Lousy Little Sixpence was incredibly difficult to make, and now it's part of the vocabulary.
Yeah.
Australia's not a country that welcomes looking at the past, and that doesn't mean to say you don't make it about the past. I mean, there are always forces that don't want the past to be told because they benefit from that past, and they don't want to acknowledge that, the stealing of land, and the foundations of Australia was pretty brutal.
Yeah.
It was pretty brutal. And, there's a kind of comfort in Australia that people try to maintain. You know, we did once have a pandemic not so long ago. Yeah, I mean, I think that's, to me, one of the examples of how we refuse to look at reality. We're having more deaths this year from a pandemic, and yet we're now out there denying that the thing exists. Exactly the same with out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah. And
most Indigenous people are out of sight, out of mind in Australia today. It is not seen as an issue again. And it's going to keep repeating itself over and over again, because you cannot deny the past and its power on the present. The intergenerational situation for Indigenous Australians based on colonial invasion of the country. And it'll just keep coming back. And great credit, we hope through the film, Tiriki and I hope through the film, that people understand and give credit to those people who gave their lives in the past to be where it is today, that they were the, and it's also another thing is to counter what history was sort of saying about the past, not only until recently, really, you know, the last 30 years or so, that it was all through the benefit of white Australians that Aboriginal people were given, you know, given these opportunities, and we give them opportunities. We give them that, and they're ungrateful if they turn around and bite the hand that feeds them, which is a whole lot of way of, you know, again, belittling people.
Yeah.
And so we hope that these people who actually spent their lives to bring what we're meant to stand for, which is a nation that's civilized, a nation that does believe in equality and justice, and they were the people who actually fought for it, not a bunch of, you know, white bureaucrats saying that they were the people looking after justice in this country. So, you know, great credit to Bill Onus. I mean, admiration to the man. That's his life. And we hope to bring it clearly onto the screen by backing up, you know, all the evidence we could to show that that man lived a remarkable life, and something we should admire. And he, you know, we should admire if we stand for the values that we're meant to have in this society.
I think you're right. I think in an election year, if you two were running for office, we'd be on the right course to a better Australia, quite frankly. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I know, what a mess.
Thank you so much, Tiriki and Alec. ABLAZE is in cinemas through Maslow Entertainment and Umbrella Entertainment from May 26th. So thank you. Thanks for an incredible film and all the very best with this ongoing journey.
Oh, thanks, Simon. Thanks for your time. Much appreciated.
Bye-bye.